Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Nobody. Now, of course, the first thing you're probably wondering is why isn't he wearing a shirt? My wife was talking to me recently, and she was telling me that if you want to get better responses on your videos, then it's a very good idea to appear in them not wearing a shirt. So I thought I would give it a try and see if this is something that the audience finds really compelling. And I'm also talking about a somewhat romantic subject today. So I thought, why not combine the two? What I have to talk about today is something that's both fun and a little bit serious. So I'll dispose of the serious part first. We all go through ups and downs in life. We go through periods where we're more depressed, or where things are going great, or where things are difficult. And I've definitely been through those times like that myself. And, I've been married almost 20 years now. And you can't be married for 20 years without having some ups and downs in your relationship, too. And at the time that I was sort of getting on top of some depressive symptoms that I was having, I was also having a hard time in my marriage, and we were kind of struggling. And I was struggling to have a good attitude and be proactive and investing in it, and really just having the right way of looking at my wife. And I started doing some things. And one thing I did was I did get advice online. I read some books. I listened to people talking about how to kind of, what practical things can you do to deal with symptoms of depression. I did end up actually being prescribed Prozac too, because for me, it seemed to actually have a cyclical rhythm to it that was not just related to what was going on in my life. And so I take a very low dose of that, much like half what the normal dose is, and that's plenty for me. And just sort of when I take it, I basically can't tell that I'm taking it. I just feel completely normal. Normal ups, normal downs. I just don't have those random, unexplained ups and downs as much. So anyway, but also after I did that, I was like, well, in good faith, I really should put some extra effort into things like my marriage and my relationship with my wife. And I got advice on that too. Not that I didn't already know a lot about all these subjects, but sometimes you have to forget what you've heard and grow back and return to it and let yourself be inspired a little bit. I know that I read things by the Gottman Institute. They had a lot of nice practical advice. Sometimes all you need is a few little things to run with. And a lot of their biggest advice comes down to just making positive bids towards your partner and receiving their positive bids in return, and upping the number of positive interactions that you have. And I can't remember if this was something that they suggested or something that I got from someone else. But one suggestion that came up where it's like, hey, you're having a hard time, and maybe part of your problem is just you kind of don't have a good attitude. And your marriage is a story that you live inside, and maybe you can actually approach that therapeutically by just treating the story in your own head, the romantic story within your own head. And so that is how I came into possession of all these. I went on a little buying spree, and this isn't all of them. I bought a bunch of others. You can see I just bought a whole bunch of rom-coms. And I said, okay, I'm not gonna talk about it. I mean, I just had to just do it. So just one day, I just said, okay. And I went online and I went onto Amazon and I just said, what are the classic sort of rom-coms? And I just looked through them and I just bought a whole load of them. A lot of them were very cheap because they were used. And they arrived, and my wife was like, what are those for? And I was like, I thought we could just watch these. And so in the evenings before bed, after our kids had gone to bed, over the course of the next few weeks, the next few months, we would just watch these classic rom-coms together. We'd just sit there and watch them. And I'll say, it had an amazing effect. It really does. The interesting thing about stories is people can often discount the value of fiction or the influence of fiction. And sometimes people read things that aren't really that great for their peace of mind. And they'll be like, oh, it's fine. It's just a story. It's just a book. It's not just a book. Your life is a story. The way that you conceptualize your existence is a story. The way you think about your family is a story. The way that you think about the universe, everything. It's how people define the world that they live in on the most true and fundamental sense. It's this very narratival way of looking at the world. And you tend to become and end up living inside the stories that you surround yourself with. And this is something that I'll talk about another time when it comes to things like news. You really need to be careful what sorts of stories you continually immerse yourselves in. Um, Christians, of course, have a verse that they look to on this subject, which is, whatever is good, whatever is pure, whatever is beautiful, fix your eyes on these good things, fill your mind with these good things, nourish yourself on them, find songs that lift you up, find stories that should lift you up, and tell them to yourself. And the Jews have also used that. They've been through all sorts of terrible things as a people. How do they sustain themselves through that? Well, it's through the power of their faith, and their faith is encapsulated in a story. It's a book. And so they sit down and they can take even terrible things that happened to them, times when people tried to exterminate them, and they turn it into a holiday. And a key part of those holidays is usually retelling the story. And they'll sit there and they'll go back through the story of things like the Passover, or the story of Esther, that's Purim, I believe, and they'll retell the story. And by doing that, they maintain their culture, they maintain their idea of who they are, what's happened to them, where they're going, their place in the world, their sense of fortitude. It has sustained them through centuries. There's something we can really learn from that culture, the way that the stories you tell sustain you. And also, I've talked a little bit about Camille Paglia. Paglia is very detailed in explaining that the stories we tell through our art are the lifeblood of our civilization. You can tell how alive a civilization is, where it's going, what it's about. And these stories can drive whole civilizations, and they can drive you. They can drive you as a person in your own life, because you're your own little civilization. You're your own little bit in the world trying to create a kingdom. And especially in a relationship, you're creating that little kingdom between you and your spouse and your kids, if you have them. And so it's very important to reground yourself in the sorts of stories that represent why you started this journey in the first place, where you're going, and just also let you relax and be reaffirmed by it too. And so rom-coms, they're great because they've been made to be, if you're a guy and you're not as into like romantic relationship movies, well, they're also funny. They got charming actors, they've got fun situations. They've tried to make them so there's something for everyone. And you can learn to invest in them. The truth is, my wife recently, because she's had such a hard time finding the rom-com market sort of died. It doesn't really exist anymore. It's hard to find, especially ones that she likes. She often will put on a new one, and I can just see how annoyed she is. I can see her just being like, "Oh, this person's such a jerk." And I've watched some movies with her and just been like, "Why are you still watching this? Do you like any of the people in this movie? Do you want anything good to happen to them? Do you care what happens to them? Or are these just awful, annoying people who you don't like, and you don't care what happens to them, and every minute you spend with them is really just a chore?" And that's how she's felt about a lot of modern movies. They're just not well written. They're not romantic. They're very inconclusive. The people are selfish. They're often just jerks. And they just contain all sorts of weird stuff. So rom-coms, we had the golden era, and the golden era of it is past. But the golden era existed, and you can still go back to it. But of course, if you want to see new things, which my wife does, she's like, well, I said, someone's got to be filling that niche. This is not like a small desire in humanity, the desire for these stories. People have been telling these stories for thousands of years. Someone is still telling them somewhere. And that's when we discovered all the Lifetime and Hallmark movies. And there's a new one too. I forget what it's called. News channel started by one of the former Hallmark execs. and they're making those rom-coms, and holy cow, they're churning out like 40 of them a year, not collectively, like individually. So I was shocked to see how many it was. So I've been going in an adventure of watching my way through Lifetime movies and Hallmark movies, and these other ones. Some of them are really cheesy, some of them are really formulaic, some of them are really low budget, some of them are they're fun, some of them are very pulpy, if you know what I mean. But you know what? After watching them, you feel better than you do after watching one of the mainstream rom coms, because you're like, those people are okay. I'm okay with what happened to them. It was silly what happened along the way. And I'll be honest, they kind of, for me, fall into two genres. You've got your Lifetime movies, which tend to look really nice and they tend to be pretty competent, and they use a lot of like TV actors from the last couple decades who are, just a little bit, further on in their careers now. And those ones I would say are competent and fairly well done. I think we watched Mississippi Christmas last night. It was fine, It was a fine movie. No serious complaints. But I'll be honest, I think I almost prefer the Hallmark movies, and I partly prefer them for their cheesiness because, and my wife doesn't really mind this because she's realized we can actually have fun. Now, that depends on your spouse, but I make her laugh a lot. When we watch those Hallmark ones and you see the same people or the same sets or the ridiculous things that happen in them, you can just laugh about it. And so I have fun. It's almost like Mystery Science Theater 3000. We get to sort of enjoy the movie, and we also get to have a little fun teasing the movie. And I'll be honest, if you've ever watched Mystery Science Theater 3000, some of my favorite movies are the ones that they're silly, they're ridiculous, they're fun to make fun of, but they're also kind of charming in their own way, and you can actually just sort of also enjoy them on their own merits. So you're kind of getting a little bit of both. And that's sort of what happens when we've been watching those movies. I feel like The Winter Palace, that was one of my favorite ones. I mean, it's not at all one of the more well done ones. It was clearly done during COVID, where they did not have access to much of a crew or much in the way of locations, and it becomes very silly. And the way that they can't show you where they're actually filming it, so you get these interior scenes at a house, and it's clearly just like, some rental place, some rental vacation place that's a winter palace. And then they'll show you these extravagant stock footage of like the Rocky Mountains, because I believe it's supposed to be up in Colorado somewhere. And as someone from Colorado, I'm just like, oh, they just showed some stock footage of like Canada, and then they just show 1 second of it and then cut to interior. They never show you too much of it, because if you looked at it too much, you'd be like, wait, there's nothing actually in this wide shot that locates me in the scene. There's no town, there's no house. I am not actually seeing anything of the actual situation that I can connect to the location where they're filming. So they just occasionally throw in 1 second, boom. And I also genuinely enjoy picking out the tropes, and also having all the silly little things that happen. And I don't mean to bore you with details about Hallmark movies too much. That's not really my subject. But boy, did I love in The Winter Palace the bit where they're trying to suggest maybe you shouldn't have been a prince. Maybe you should have been an artist. Wow, are these your sculptures? And it's just these absolutely cheap, cruddy, tacky, touristy like sculptures of like a bear, like that you would just pick up at like some store on the way to Estes Park or something, some mountain town. She's like, oh, you should definitely stop renting a country and go all in on this. I bet you can get $50 for that. I mean, some of the sculptures look like they're made out of like paper mache. It's hilarious. They just clearly used whatever junk they could get a hold of at the time. So as I said, I actually really enjoy the silliness of a lot of those movies. And I've found ways to enjoy it. And my wife likes watching them, and it turns out lots of women do. So the Hallmark Channel during the fourth quarter is the number one most watched cable channel for women 18 to 54. That's like the whole a demographic of all women within their reproductive years, basically. And that's crazy. I didn't know people were even watching it at all. To find out that it was around Christmas time, the number one thing being watched was a shock. And it just tells you something about what I thought was right. It's like people can't stop being people. People still want these stories, and those stories are going to go somewhere. Someone's going to fill that market, someone's going to find that niche. Um, and actually, I also appreciate with Hallmark the way they do work as this sort of team group and repeated cast, repeated crew. And you can see for some of the people, it gives them a chance to actually like have a steady acting job while also have a life, which is often it can be really hard as an actor. I used to want to be an actor myself. It can be a really hard life, both on you trying to find the work and also, especially on your family. If you're trying to have a family, if you're trying to have a life of any kind outside of it, it can just eat everything up. But if you just are like, oh, I know I've got a contract with these people. I'm going to make 6 movies this year. Each one of them is going to take 2 weeks. I'm going to work with people I know. I can bring my family with me while I work on the movie, which a bunch of these stars do. And I actually think that's great. It actually makes the making of them kind of romantic. And I've read about the process of the people that write and direct and design them and decorate for them. And it's interesting. And, it's become kind of an institution. Um, People want those stories. So don't discount their value. Don't just be completely cynical about it. And if you are going to be a little cynical, like I am, be cynical in a loving way. The best satire also finds something to love in that person. That's something that I learned from listening to SNL people. I think it was Norm Macdonald who was talking about doing impressions of people. He says, you can't do a good impression of someone who you just hate. Like that kind of satire just becomes too predictable. It becomes too flat. It doesn't have a life to it. He says, because that's not realistic. That person has things that they love about themselves. And you need to figure that out. You need to find what's lovable about that person in order to also sort of criticize and tease them. And that ends up being the most fun. And so whether it's Norm Macdonald with the many characters that he has skewered, you can tell he also just enjoys playing those parts. And the same way with some of the great political skewerings, like Dana Carvey doing George Bush Sr. It's good natured. There's even a little give and take with the actual real person. But there's teasing and making fun of people doesn't just have to be a negative bullying thing or just critical. It's something that can help you come to terms with people. It lets you freely expose the flaws and laugh at them, and sometimes you have to learn to live with them, and that's helpful too. Anyway, so back to the subject of buying the rom-coms. It really did help. It really did actually make a big difference. It made a big difference in my outlook, and it really did improve my romantic motivation. It improved my enthusiasm for it. It gave me more drive. It gave me more energy. It reoriented my brain. You can get stuck into these negative thought patterns and negative stories, and it just helps draw you out of it. So I wanted to improve my marriage, and I said, I'll buy rom-coms. And you know what? It really worked. Like I said, I couldn't find all the ones that I bought, but I thought I'd just go back to that classic era. And of course, we watched some older ones too. My wife likes those old movies, and we watched a good amount of. We really went back to some of those classic old movies and found out, oh, there's actually a reason why these were so popular and so classic back in the day. A lot of them really do hold up. Some of them were fantastic. I watched a number of old musicals with my wife, like Oklahoma, Showboat, Gone with the Wind. I hadn't seen any of those ever. I had never taken the time to sit down and watch any of those. But I sat down and watched all of them, and I was like, wow, I'm actually really impressed by this. I just thought they looked sort of silly and dumb, and you have your idea of them. And Gone with the Wind, I was like, wow, this is actually whatever you want to say about it. It is a gigantic, epic, sweeping story with detailed characters. You can tell it was a novel with, covering these